All right, I think now's a good time to get started. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Inside the Application, literally, for the Yale School of Management Masters in Asset Management program. My name is Laurel Grodman. I'm Assistant Dean of Admissions, and I am also a member of the Yale SOM MBA class of 2006. Thanks so much for joining us today. So as the title of the event implies, I am going to open up our application literally and share my screen and provide a walkthrough of the application live. This is a little bit of a different event than the ones that will happen later in the year. We'll go through some of the more technical aspects of the application. I think this is a really great place to start if you're just opening up the application and starting to think about how your plan for completing it is going to be mapped out over the next couple of months. And there will be other events that follow this that are a little bit more focused on being interactive and answering your questions. There won't be a Q&A on today's event, but like I said, we'll have a number of events coming up where you will have a chance to speak with members of the admissions team and ask any specific questions that you have about your application process. So we'll go through the application. I'll also note a couple of parts of the process that happen after you hit submit, namely our video questions, our behavioral assessment, and the interview. And we will go from there. So before I open the application itself, I did want to share a few words about the program and the philosophy behind our approach to the application and how we evaluate candidates, which I hope will frame our walkthrough in some useful ways. And so starting with the program itself, the Yale School of Management Masters in Asset Management program is really the only program specifically focused on the field of asset management within a broader finance framework. So combining the best of theory and practice is a highly specialized program to prepare you for a career in asset management. It was founded by our faculty director, Toby Moskowitz, as well as the late David Swenson, the longtime manager of the Yale University Endowment. And they really created this program with an emphasis on asset management as a field in which you can both do well and do good. So it's a career that can be highly lucrative and generative in that sense, but also one in which you can have a real impact on both the businesses that you work with and more society at large. And so within that program, they created a structure that has what I'd say are three really distinctive features. The first are the classes that you take. So it is a combination of a core classes specifically focused on the field of asset management, so things like asset pricing and quantitative investing and machine learning, and taught by our world-class finance faculty. And then also electives that you can take both specifically developed for the asset management curriculum, so things like ESG investing, but also you have access to the broader array of electives within the Yale School of Management, and then even beyond that within the Yale University at large. So you could take classes in the computer science department or in the Yale University econ department. So again, developing a really comprehensive curriculum that's tailored towards the areas that you want to specialize in. The second key component is a practical experience requirement. So we want to give you a chance to apply these skills in practice once you've joined the program. And so everyone will have a chance to gain some practical experience either through an internship or through research with a professor, or you might do an investment focused case competition. So some way to put those skills into practice. And then the third part of the program that I'll highlight is really distinctive is our colloquium. So again, this idea of merging theory and practice, we bring in leader practitioners from various fields of asset management. So it could be the leader of a university endowment or a principal at a quant fund or someone who works in the legal or regulatory landscape. Again, giving you as members of the Masters of Asset Management class unique access in a more intimate setting to hearing from leaders and being able to converse with them and understand what the leadership challenges are within the space. We also have a highly dedicated CDO career development office support structure in place. This is a highly specialized career search to land on your path in the field of asset management. And so there is a lot of individualized attention and support in the process of securing your next step. And I'll mention lastly, this is a 9-month program that is STEM eligible for international students. It is a lot that we cram into 9 months, but again, all geared towards allowing you to launch a career in asset management. So with that, a little bit of background I think is helpful in understanding why we structure the application in the way that we do to bring in people who we're confident are going to be successful and take full advantage of this really unique program. So I'll say at a high level before I open up the application itself. In our evaluation process, we're really looking for 3 things. First thing is your academic preparedness with a particular lens on assessing your quantitative preparedness. We want to set people up for success in a really rigorous and quantitative program. The second thing is your professional impact and potential. So this can be demonstrated through your work experience, your extracurricular involvement, your personal interests, and all the different things that you've dedicated yourself to thus far. And then the third thing that we're looking for is your desire to make an impact in the field of asset management, both immediately after graduating from the program and beyond. And so really that's it, those 3 things. And every single thing that we ask within our application really aids the admissions committee in our assessment of one or more of these dimensions. And we look at all of the aspects of your application holistically to pull the information we need, given your own unique academic history and professional experience and personal background. And so what that really means is there's no one ideal candidate for the asset management program, but rather students can come from a variety of different academic and professional backgrounds and find success within the program. We're really looking at your entire history kind of in tandem. And so it's important to remember that within that this program is targeted towards what we call early career professionals, which really refers to being early in your asset management career. So whether you're coming directly from undergraduate experience or you've been working in another field for a while and looking to make a pivot. So we expect to see a range in terms of both the quantity and the depth of professional experience, as well as the distance from your academic studies. So as we go through the different components of the application, keep in mind this is built to collect information from a lot of different pathways, a lot of different individual trajectories. And so as part of the holistic admissions process, we'll rely more heavily on your academic experiences and perhaps your internship or research experiences the closer you are to your academic life, whether you're a current senior or a recent graduate. And if you have more professional experience, we'll of course be incorporating that and looking to understand sort of that depth of experience within our review process. So it's the same overall criteria that we're considering for everyone. Again, that academic readiness, your professional impact, and your interest in making an impact in the field of asset management. But we might look at those in slightly different balances depending on where you are within your trajectory. I'll mention that all admitted applicants to our program are automatically considered for merit-based scholarships. We don't have a separate kind of essay or application required for scholarship consideration. Scholarship recipients are based on their exemplification of those very same 3 factors that I just shared with you and the perspective that you'll add to the class. And you'll be notified of your scholarship award at the same time that you're admitted. I'll mention also that after being admitted, there's also a small window in which you can share information to be considered for a modest amount of need-based aid. But I emphasize that the merit-based process is really based on these same criteria that we're going to go through today. All right, so as a final point, I'll note that our application deadline for the Master's in Asset Management class is January 9th, and we'll release decisions on March 27th. So a single application round. And we won't begin reviewing applications until January. So while it's great to get a head start on completing your application, there is no advantage in submitting it early. So with that, I am going to just take a moment and open up the application itself so we can start going through the application literally. So give me just a moment. Okay. So starting at the very beginning with the instructions, everyone's favorite page. What I will say is we've actually put a great deal of attention into the instructions throughout the application. While it's great that you're attending today's event, We have tried to create our application in such a way that you are given all the information that you could possibly need to successfully complete the application within the pages. So please do take the time to read through the specifics just to make sure you're giving us all the information that we need in the exact way that we would need it. I'll also mention, as an additional support, we have put together a list of FAQs that you have access to, which again gives a little bit more color as a supplement to the instructions that we give within the application itself. One thing I'll note that is important here is you'll see the application deadline, January 9th, but we also have what's called a post-submission materials deadline. So there are a handful of materials that you'll need to complete, and you have a short window after the application deadline to do so, but that's really specifically sending us your official test scores. We'll get into testing in a little bit, the video questions and the behavioral assessment. So all three of those things we'll talk about a little bit more later, but you have a short window after the deadline to provide those. I'll mention we have a variety of categories of fee waivers. So you can read that closely and make sure that you complete the form to request a fee waiver if you fall into one of these categories well in advance of your application submission, but no later than 48 hours prior to submitting your application. I will also just mention lastly on this page, this is the first year we have put out an official statement on AI. And I'll share a little bit about this. It's less rules and more guidance. So we understand and we embrace the fact that AI is now playing an increased role in all of our day-to-day activities. And we won't prohibit you from using AI in some sense in how you think about completing your application. But I will say definitely use it with some caution. I think the best framework maybe to think about it is the same way that you might approach a trusted friend or colleague to help you think through your approach to a graduate program application. I think you can think about AI in that same sense, in that it can be a good source of helping you brainstorm or ideate or organize your thoughts. Maybe as a sort of last step for grammar or spelling check and minor edits, but our expectation is that the written and spoken materials within your application are your own. And so just as you wouldn't ask a friend or a colleague to write your essay or write any component of your application for you, you should approach AI in the same way. And we'll talk a little bit about the spoken components of your application later as well. But my strong advice in that area in a word is just don't. The spoken aspects of your application are not going to benefit from AI use. And in fact, could be quite damaging to you. So I would encourage you to expect to approach those aspects of your application, again, in your own authentic voice. But we'll get a little bit more into that later. So with that, I'm going to open up with a statement of honesty that you'll sign. So the personal information section is fairly straightforward. A lot of this is pretty basic demographical and biographical information, but here's where we'll start to get some context for who you are and where you're coming from. A couple of things that I'll call out specifically along the bottom here. Again, most of this is demographic and biographic information. I will mention here that we do offer a joint degree program with our MBA. So it's a combined MBA and Master's in Asset Management program. It is a 2-year program in which you'll first complete the core MBA in your first year and then complete the asset management degree in your second year. And we do ask you to identify whether you are intending to apply to that joint degree in the context here. I'll note these are entirely separate application processes. So if you want to apply to the joint degree, you'll have to apply separately to the MBA and the asset management program, and you will get 2 separate decisions, from those 2 programs. But we will ask you to note here if that's your intention. And so we'll have a sense of that as we're reviewing your application. All right, again, this is a fairly straightforward page, but starting to get more into the thick of things, academic record. So it's really the next 2 sections, your academic record and your test scores, that work in tandem for us. So that first area that I mentioned as an overview that we're looking to assess is your academic readiness for the program. So we are looking at this section, the academic record, along with your testing, which we'll get to next. Again, really in tandem. We're not looking at it at those components in the same way for every single candidate. It's going to depend on what you studied. So for instance, if you studied something highly quantitative in undergrad and did really well in those classes and have all of the kind of quantitative coverage that you need through that experience, perhaps the quantitative area of your test score is applied with a little bit less weight in that context versus if you have the reverse. So again, there's no specific weighting to this, but we're looking at all this information together. So the academic record, this is an area where I'd say read the instructions really closely. This is the absolute number one area that holds up an application review, having incomplete information here. And you don't want that to be the case where we can't thoroughly review or proceed with the review of an application because we don't have all the information that we need here. So again, I'd suggest reading this really, really carefully. I'll call out a few areas here specifically that sometimes tend to trip people up. So transcripts, we are very well versed in receiving transcripts from all over the world, different academic systems, different grading systems. But it is really helpful for you to provide all of the information that your institution gives along with your transcript, including a grading key. So many times if you have a physical transcript, there will be a key on the back. So make sure that you're providing that to us as well. And if your university does not provide that along with your transcript, we'll ask you to provide a link to the university online resource that gives sort of the translation key for your transcript. So again, that's a really helpful thing to be able to provide. I'll mention if you are currently in school, which many of our applicants are, so you'll be applying likely in your senior year or your final year of studies. It's important that you give us the most up-to-date transcript that you have. So if you are applying in January, we will hopefully receive a transcript from you that includes your fall semester grades or your most recent semester of grades. And then ideally the coursework that you were enrolled in for the coming semester as well. We realize everyone's on different sort of systems and timelines. So if in fact you don't have that available to you, we'll ask that you provide us with updates as you go. So as grades come in, as courses are registered for, you'll have an opportunity to provide updated materials through your application portal. And it's really important that we have the most up-to-date information as we're reviewing your application. And typically that will benefit you. The more coursework that you can show and the more we know about the upcoming kind of coursework that you're enrolled in, I think the better. The other thing that I will mention in this section is as we move sort of downwards, so you'll give us information about your overall kind of academic experience. So your undergraduate program, if you've had a sort of a graduate school program as well, you will include that along with your transcripts. And I'll point out we are looking not only at the ending sort of GPA, but we really are looking to understand your entire academic trajectory. Has your performance picked up speed as you've gone through the course of your academics? Have you challenged yourself with difficult coursework? So it's really not just the GPA at the end of the day. We are digging into your transcript as a whole. But you'll see we also ask a lot of questions about quantitative background. And I want to take a moment to talk about this a little bit because I know this can be a little bit intimidating, both in length and in depth. What I'll start by saying is we have identified there are a number of areas of coursework that are really beneficial in letting you hit the ground running to complete the asset management program. I would say those are multivariable calculus or having kind of extensive work, in calculus, linear or matrix algebra, microeconomics, and then sort of an intermediate level of statistics. So I think that is ideally exposure that you will have had coming into the program. I will say in practice, relatively few students will have had that exposure exactly in all of those areas. People are coming in with all kinds of different backgrounds, all kinds of different academic programs of study. So those are areas that we know are important and we're looking for and are beneficial, I think, to your application, but please don't be intimidated by the idea that, oh, I haven't had all of this coursework to date, or my course of study wouldn't have even allowed for this. We admit plenty of people to the program who have had some or in some cases, none of this exposure, although ideally you've had at least a little bit. This does give us a sense of your starting point, though, and how much kind of catch up in a way it'll be important for you to do prior to coming into the program. We do have what we call a summer self-study program that will give you exposure to the areas that you have not previously had exposure to in these areas of coverage. So this, again, gives us a little bit of a sense of where, if you're admitted to the program, we will suggest that you focus your summer self-study. So again, we ask for a lot of information here, but don't be intimidated by the idea that this is a requirement in any way that you've had exposure to all of these areas previously. The other area that I should mention in there is computer science. So we are interested in hearing what kind of exposure you've had to programming languages. So we'll ask you to include some information there as well. Every single person coming into the program will take a summer self-study course in Python as preparation for the coursework that you'll do here. But again, this is just giving us a sense of where you are as a starting point. So within this, you'll be asked to identify up here in kind of the coursework area, the precise information about the courses that you've taken. If in fact your coursework has been, if in fact your coursework has a title that is not necessarily suggestive of the course here, in fact, we see a lot of times people will take maybe an engineering course that covers multiple different subjects, like Math 1 for engineering. What we'll ask you to do is just identify kind of what that coursework is down here in this section and provide a syllabus just so we can understand exactly what Math 1 for engineering covered and make sure it in fact does maybe cover multivariable calculus, linear algebra, and intro statistics. So again, the more information that you can give us to help us kind of unpack your coursework, I think the better. So appreciate you taking the time to do that. And then, in this section, we ask you to list your formal coursework, so things that you have taken for a grade and where you've received an assessment. But we know that people also do a lot of self-study on their own potentially, and there's a lot of online resources for doing that kind of thing. And so we do give you an opportunity to share with us if you have taken any non-graded courses, for instance, in these areas, and to share a little bit more information about it. So again, we are looking in a lot of places to get a holistic as possible sense of the exposure that you've had to the quantitative coursework that we're talking about, the computer programming languages, as well as understanding your general academic path. Okay. And so the next piece of it that I mentioned that we're using to assess your academic readiness are your test scores. So in testing, we require that everyone submit either a GMAT or a GRE. We have no preference among the two tests. Either are equally acceptable. And we ask that you provide verified test scores regardless of the test that you were taking. And so that's where I mentioned a little bit earlier, the post-material submission deadline. So you have, I think, 3 days after the formal deadline, 3 or 4 days after the formal deadline to submit your official test scores to us, but you will self-report them when you fill them out here. We ask that you include all the scores that you've achieved, not just your best. We will always consider your best testing for purposes of admission, but it's helpful for us to see sometimes you've scored higher on a particular subsection in a previous test. We look at progression of test scores. So again, we ask you to provide all of the test scores that you've taken to date, but we will, of course, credit you for your best performance. I will mention specifically, we also have an English language testing requirement for those for whom native language is not English, or if you haven't not completed a degree in an English-speaking country. So read the instructions here carefully just to make sure that you understand whether you have an English language testing requirement. For instance, specifically if you are if you're studying in a country or territory that lists English as an official language, there's a sort of specific qualification there. So again, I'm not going to go into all the specifics now, but just make sure you read the testing requirements specifically here to know. if that's a requirement for you. And if so, we accept the TOEFL, the DET, and the IELTS. Again, no preference among those, whichever test is most convenient and most readily available to you, we're happy to accept. A question we get frequently is whether we accept updated test scores after the deadline. I'll say yes with an asterisk. Yes, but there is no guarantee, depending on where we are in the admissions process, that we'll be able to sort of consider test score updates. We try to as best as we can. And again, you'll use the application portal to provide any updates, including on testing. Best case scenario is you have, the test score that you are happy with prior to submitting your application. You do need to have a test score to submit your application. But in terms of retaking the test, you're welcome to do so. We'll do our best to incorporate that information, but we can't guarantee that we can after the formal deadline. Okay, so that takes us through academic record and test scores, which we are using in concert with one another to get an understanding of your academic preparedness. Jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll say the one other aspect of the application that gives us some insight into your academic readiness is letter of recommendation. So I'll talk a little bit more about recommendations as we get to that section, but we do ask for one academic and one sort of professional or applied experience within your recommendations. And so your academic recommendation, again, will sort of be the final piece along with your testing and your academic record to give us a sense of your academic readiness for the program. Okay, so next we'll move into work experience. All right, so kind of going back to the beginning and thinking about the three things that we're looking for, getting an understanding of your professional impact and potential is that second area. And the next couple of sections give us insight into, again, helping us better understand that. And I'll reiterate here that this is really meant to meet you where you are. So we will have applicants to the program who are coming directly from undergraduate experiences and therefore don't have any full-time work experience. And then we'll have people who are, have been out in the workforce, either for a couple of years or even potentially longer if you're looking to pivot into the field of asset management. So this is built to, again, meet you where you are and get a sense of the applied experience that you've had, whether it's been through full-time work or something else. And so we give you opportunity to give us your experience in a lot of different formats. And so you'll see in particular for particularly important for those who are currently undergraduates and don't have full-time work experience, but also potentially for those with full-time work experience, but who have internships that they want to present to us. We have an entire section on how to represent an internship. And we know that internships come in a lot of different forms and flavors, depending on where you are in the world, the field in which you're gaining experience. And so we value the experience that you gain in a number of different ways through an internship, but we want to make sure that we understand sort of the nature of that experience and how you came to secure that internship, in part so that we can properly verify those experiences if you are admitted to the program and go through that process. We want to make sure that we know the proper channels through which to do that. And so again, I encourage you, if you'll be listing internships of any sort, if you read this, that, we encourage you to read this section carefully just to make sure that you are doing that exactly the way that we are expecting. I'm actually going to open up sort of the internal part here. So one area of the application where I think if you save your work until the night before it's due, that you'll be very surprised at how much we're asking of you is this section over here, where we ask you to list out your individual experiences. We actually ask you for quite a bit of information about every single one of these experiences, because again, we want to gain as much insight into your experiences as possible and give everyone a fair opportunity to express what it is that they're doing. And so you'll see there's quite a few questions that you'll be asked within, not all of which I've filled out in my own test application here, but particularly relevant for things like internships. How many hours of work per week was it? The modality, we ask you to identify, was it primarily in person or remote? Obviously dates of employment, fairly kind of standard things over here, but we also ask you to give us some information about, actually this isn't this isn't the greatest example here. I'll pull up a different one. A company description, which gives us an opportunity. If it's an organization we may not be as familiar with, it gives you a chance to tell us in a few words about what that company is all about, a brief description of your role, and then a little bit about how you secured that experience. So again, this would be an example of an internship. We ask you to give us a little bit information about how you came to be hired for this particular work. Were you hired by an individual? Was it through a broader company recruiting process? Was there an interview process? Again, this isn't meant to be an essay, but just a few words that help us understand how you achieved that particular position. And then finally, if there is an official record of your employment, again, we know that sometimes people do work for an individual versus a company. That is fine. We just want to make sure that we have kind of that appropriate understanding. So we'll ask you to list your hiring manager as well as their official work email address so that we can properly follow up if need be on that experience. So again, there's quite a bit of information in here. So I would definitely encourage you to spend more time rather than less on that aspect of the application, again, to give us the most robust sense as possible of your career trajectory. We also give you an opportunity here to share your resume. So while this collection of information is a little bit more kind of logistically oriented about, when and where of your work, your resume is an opportunity to highlight your accomplishments and what you've achieved in your roles. We do offer a version of a resume template for you to use. You absolutely do not need to. This is more just if you're looking for a starting point, but this happens to be the format of the resume that everybody who is a member of the Yale SOM community will use as part of your recruiting efforts once you're here. So that template is available for you if you'd like. A couple of other things that I'll note here, and this can be more relevant to those who are post-undergraduate and already in the workforce. We do give you an opportunity to explain if you have any gaps in your work experience. Gaps are not necessarily a bad thing in any way, but often warrant a little bit more explanation than a resume can provide. So if you have a gap in employment of more than 3 months or are currently unemployed, this again meaning post-undergraduate, assuming you're not in graduate school program, you have an opportunity to help us, understand what it was that you were doing during that time. There's lots of things that are, meaningful outside of full-time employment, and this is an opportunity for you to share a little bit more context and detail around that. Okay, with that, I'm going to move along to the recommendation section. So we talked a little bit about before about what the letters of recommendation are meant to encompass. So again, one of them is meant to be from an academic setting, and the other in a professional, or what I'd call more broadly an applied setting. So someone who has seen you in applying your skills in a workplace or workplace adjacent setting. And so this could be obviously very kind of traditional full-time work, if that is where you are kind of within your career trajectory. It can certainly be from an internship, but it could also be perhaps you did academic research, extensive research in an academic setting. I would consider that maybe more the professional or applied recommendation, maybe than strictly an academic recommendation, which is more likely someone who observed you in a classroom setting, although there's could potentially be a blurred line there. But someone who has seen you put your skills into practice and see how you operate in a professional setting. I would highly recommend securing a recommendation from what you'd consider to be your most significant professional or applied experience. So rather than reaching back something that you did several years ago, I would highly suggest whatever your most relevant current experience or recent experience is usually going to be your best source of recommendation. Although we certainly understand there are sometimes reasons why that doesn't make sense in your particular situation. So you have to somewhat use your best judgment, but I find that those are the recommendations that tend to be the most useful within our assessment process. My other tip on recommendation is give your recommenders as much time as possible. It is always going to be a stronger recommendation if your recommender has some time to think it through. And you can, of course, feel free to have a conversation with them, let them know about your interest in graduate school or interest in the asset management program. You can provide them with, a reminder or refresher of sort of the highlights of your work with that individual. But obviously, it goes without saying, I'll say it though, the expectation is that the recommendation be entirely written by your recommender. You should have no hand in writing the recommendation. So I would advise against providing any kind of written materials to them outside of a resume to refresh them, just to make sure that that recommendation is as authentic and genuine as we expect it to be. So with that, I think that's probably where we collect the majority of your information again about your professional impact from that work experience section as well as the recommendation section. So with that, we'll move on to the kind of final area that I mentioned within the top of the hour here, which is your interest in and passion for making an impact in the field of asset management, both immediately after graduation and beyond. And so we are really incredibly straightforward about giving you an opportunity to talk about this. We have one required essay, and the essay is, what are your short and long-term career interests? Please describe what drives these interests and how they connect to your academic, professional, or personal experiences. So this is an opportunity for you to be both backwards looking and forwards looking, right? To talk about what it is that you have done to date that has driven your interest in being a part of this program and what you'll hopefully do going forward from there. So looking backwards and connecting it to the experiences and the exposure that you've had to date and what has sparked that interest. And then what you hope to do, with the knowledge that you will gain through this program into the future, both in the short term and the long term. So again, I think that this is a fairly straightforward essay. It is not a personal statement. It is not a creative writing exercise. It is, again, a fairly straightforward opportunity for you to express why this is of interest to you and what you are hoping to do with it going forward. So 500-word limit, which I think is a reasonable amount of real estate to be able to dedicate to sharing all that information with you. Again, it paints a little bit of a little bit more color about your interest above and beyond what we're already seeing in the areas that you've studied or the areas that you've pursued experience thus far. I'll mention if you are a joint degree applicant to our MBA program, there is a short prompt as well in which you'll get to share a little bit more about your interest in pursuing those in conjunction. And then lastly, I wouldn't call this an essay, but for everyone, you will have an opportunity to complete an optional information kind of statement, if you will. Again, I very intentionally called this not an essay because it is meant to not be completed by everybody. In fact, I think only in fairly rare circumstances will anyone need to complete this section. But the way to think about that is if there's anything that we're asking about in the application that you don't feel as though you've been able to sort of adequately share the context for, maybe you aren't able to provide a letter of recommendation from your current employer, and you maybe haven't shared that you're planning on applying to graduate school with them, and so you have a reason for that. This is the opportunity to give us a brief note about that. Or maybe there's an area of your academic performance that requires a little bit more explanation. This is an opportunity to tell us about that. So I really think about it as if you haven't had adequate opportunity within the application to share more information about the things we've asked you for, this is an opportunity to give us that. I would not use this to answer questions that we haven't asked. So this isn't a second essay or a place to put in a personal statement or to say why you want to go to Yale SOM so much. Again, really, I think it would be the exception to have a response to the optional statement. So I'd say use it judiciously, really only to provide supplemental information to the questions that we are asking. Okay. So with that, I will move along to the activities section. So this is actually a section that can fit into any number of the other areas or of the key areas that I discussed: academics, professional impact, or interest in asset management. Essentially, we know that you are more than just your classwork or your work. And I want to give you an opportunity to share with us what else you tend to engage in. And so we give you an opportunity to list up to two both undergraduate and post-undergraduate activities. And what we're really asking you to do here, because we know that you may potentially be involved in more than just two activities, we want you to really home in on the things that are highest impact in your lives, and so things that you've dedicated the most of your time and talents to. And so identifying, again, during the time that you were an undergraduate, and if you were post-undergrad, up to two things post-undergraduate that you've engaged in, and you'll give us a little bit of detail about that. Again, there's nothing in particular that is better or worse to include here. We give you a broad array of things that you could list here, from extracurricular activities to sports to volunteer work, research activities. It could be part-time employment that you use to fund your schooling. It could be familial roles or responsibilities. Again, people engage in a wide array of activities outside of work and school. So we want to give you an opportunity to share as much as possible of that. Okay, rounding out the sort of written component of the application, background information. So this is an entirely optional section. There is no required information in this section, but this is an opportunity for us to understand a little bit more about your personal background that may provide context to either the choices or the opportunities that you've had throughout your lives, throughout your academic lives, your professional lives, your own personal experiences, a little bit more background information about who you are and where you're coming from. And again, it's optional, but we encourage you to consider completing this section, again, to give us a more robust sense of of where you're coming from. And so we'll ask questions about your family information, your childhood, things that will help assess whether you're a first-generation college student, for instance. A little bit more about your background, your upbringing, about your family. And beyond the kind of formal questions that we ask, if you want an opportunity either to elaborate on any of the information that you've shared above, or provide any other information about your background that will be important for us to really assess your application in a holistic sense, this is your chance to do that. We give you the window here to provide what we call supplemental details. So again, we're really trying to understand you as an applicant as holistically as possible. And so trying to give you a lot of opportunities within the application to help, again, give texture, give us a sense of who you are so that we can bring all of the information together. So that is the last sort of formal section of the written application. I did say in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to touch upon a couple of the things that happen post-application, namely the video questions, the behavioral assessment, and the interview. So give me just a moment. So I'll start with the video questions. So again, you have a brief window after the application deadline to submit the video questions, behavioral assessment, and your formal official test scores. But the video questions help us do a couple of things. First, it's an opportunity to hear us, for us to hear your spoken language, which is helpful in helping us assess English language skills if you're a non-native English speaker, and more generally, how you articulate yourself on your feet, which is an important skill to have in a graduate school classroom, and I would argue more in life in general. So it gives us an opportunity to do that in a couple of ways. So what they actually are is you'll hear a member of our admissions committee asking a question. You'll get sort of a question from a randomized bank. You'll have a chance to hear the question, and depending on the question, either 20 or 30 seconds to think about your response. And then again, depending on the question, either 60 or 90 seconds to deliver your response. Those are the two kind of spoken questions. And then third, you'll receive a written question, and then you'll have, I believe, 8 minutes to complete a written response to those questions. So again, giving us a chance to ask you some different probe on some different areas than what we get from your application itself, and also hear you articulate yourself on your feet, which is important for us to be able to assess in that way. These aren't meant to stress you out. These aren't brain teasers or case questions or math problems or anything like that. Again, these are the preparation that you would do for this is no different than what you would do to prepare more generally for your graduate school interviews, but just knowing yourself, knowing your resume is the best advice I could give. I would also suggest just get familiar with what a 60 or 90-second time frame feels like. Depending on who you are and what your speaking style is, that could go really quickly or really slowly. You're not required to use the entire length, but just getting familiar with what it's like to answer a question in that time frame. I should mention you will have the opportunity to go through as many practice questions as you'd like within the platform before you go through the formal video questions. So you'll have a chance to get comfortable with that as well. So that's the video questions in a nutshell. The behavioral assessment is an online non-cognitive assessment. So unlike the GMAT or the GRE, which is a cognitive test, the behavioral assessment, which is issued by ETS, which also issues the GRE, is what we call a non-cognitive test. So it looks at interpersonal and intrapersonal skills that we know are associated with success in management programs. Again, not meant to be intimidating or anything that you need to do prep work for. It is a 20 to 25-minute test that you'll sit down for. And what it'll essentially do is present you with pairs of statements. So it'll be things like, I like to go to meetings and I'm an organized person. And you have to pick the one that feels more like you. And you'll go through 130 of these pairings. And no two people will get the exact same pairings. I assure you, no one answer or no 10 answers to these questions are going to determine whether you're going to be admitted to the program. But again, it gives us a little bit different dimension than the rest of your application of who you are and what you bring to the table. And again, whether you possess some of the qualities that we know are associated with success in a program like this. But I wouldn't stress about it. This is not used in a heavy way within our application program, but you do want to make sure that you give yourself 20 to 25 minutes to complete it in the days following your application submission. So the last thing I'll mention then is interviews. So interviews are by invitation only. We won't interview everyone who applies to the program, but everyone who we admit to the program will have received an interview. We offer interview invitations really, throughout the time that we receive your applications and beyond. I always say someone has to be the first and last person reviewed in the application process. So please don't stress out and contact the office if you have not received an invitation to interview. We promise we will be in touch with everyone who we plan on moving forward with in that way. And the interview will be an opportunity to have a 30-minute discussion with a member of the admissions team, about your background and your interests in the program, and to share a little bit more depth about your application. So with that is pretty much the whole application process in a nutshell. As I mentioned before, there are opportunities to update us on your application after you've hit submit through your application portal. We require you to update us on really kind of material updates. So things like changes to your academics, new grades, things like that. If you have a new testing, if your work status has changed in any way, if you've changed jobs, if anything, again, that you've provided within your application has materially changed, we ask that you provide us with an update through the application portal. That'll be important there. But I hope you found this helpful kind of taste. It's a lot of information, a lot of sort of components to the application, I know, for you to juggle. So I really applaud you for joining at this stage when you still have a couple of months to go. But hopefully this gives you a sense of the areas that we focus on, some of the work that you'll need to put in before submitting your master's in asset management application. But as I mentioned at the start of the hour, there are going to be a lot of opportunities for you to engage with us along the way. Our team wants to be accessible to you as you complete your application. And so just a couple of things I'll call out in the near term. We have an Ask Me Anything session happening tomorrow, actually. That's geared towards starting your application. So if you have questions coming out of today of, where you get started on some of these areas, that'll be a great opportunity to ask some questions of our admissions team. An event of a different sort coming up. We have a master class with Professor Toby Moskowitz, our faculty director for the program on AI and machine learning, which I think will be really, really interesting to get sort of a glimpse into this cutting edge area with a lot of relevancy to the field of asset management. So that's taking place on October 1st. I highly encourage signing up for that. If you're able to. And then more generally, I know over the next couple of months, as you gear up for your application, we have a lot of different types of application-oriented activities as well. Again, things that'll allow you to more individually ask questions about your candidacy, as well as to dive a little bit more deeply into some of these areas that I touched upon today, to make sure that you're fully prepared for that January 9th deadline. So thank you so much for joining today. I appreciate it. And look forward to hopefully having the chance to review many of your applications in the coming months. So once again, thanks so much for joining.